Our scripture reading for this evening will be Mark 1, verses 35 through 42. Yeah. And it says, "Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. And Simon's those who were with him searched for him. When they found him, they said to him, 'Everyone is looking for you.' But he said to them, 'Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, because for this purpose I have come forth.' And he was preaching in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and cast demons. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, 'If you are willing, you may make me clean.' Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretching out his hand and touched him, and said to him, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed."
Thank you, Will, so much. Found out this evening that Will and I are going to be buddies. I sliced my finger trying to make sweet potato chips this afternoon, and apparently Will did the same, but his finger is still there, so he looks like he's doing just fine, so I guess I will also. Hannah actually ended up doing the same thing, but thank you, Will, so much for reading that passage. You see there in Mark chapter 1 what it is that's going on during the ministry of Christ and what's taking place. You see that all are looking for him, they're seeking him out, they're searching for him, and he is having to separate himself in order to pray, in order to get some alone time with the Father. And he's being told then in verse 37, "Everyone is looking for you." He goes on into other towns as his purpose was to go and to seek and to save the lost. And then one indeed comes and finds him, seeks him out so that he can be cleansed, as we see following the rest of the passage. This one is interested in being cleansed, interested in being made whole once again, physically speaking. And we can understand this if we contemplate our own physical lives and what it is that we desire concerning our state and our health. We certainly desire to be in the best of health, and if anything were to go south or be wrong, we would like to seek out the best care. Well, Jesus was the best care available, and so many were seeking him out. We're looking for healing, looking for comfort, given their physical infirmities. But that's not ultimately why Jesus came forth. He came to save his people from their sins. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21. The reason as to why he came was so that people would seek him out so that they could be cleansed in the way that matters the most, and that is regarding their spiritual infirmities, concerning the lot that they had regarding their placement in regards to God, as to where they stood. And so Jesus came to seek and to save the lost, came to preach the gospel so that mankind could be cleansed, could be made whole, spiritually speaking. When we think about seeking, and we think about the world around us today, we think about ourselves and our own spiritual seeking and what it is that we look after and long for, we need to understand, first of all, that seeking is something that God commands us to do. It's something that we are required to do. And we see several scriptures that provide us this kind of insight. For example, look with me beginning in the book of Psalms, Psalm 27 and verse 4. The psalmist writes there, "One thing I have desired of the Lord, that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." We studied this morning in our Bible class what the temple is really all about, what God's kingdom is all about. It's not this physical world. It's not his physical kingdom or a physical house. That's not where God dwells, but instead it is his church. So if you apply Psalm 27 and verse 4 to today's time, we essentially would say that we are desiring to dwell in the church and to inquire of the church and to behold the beauty of the Lord where it is found ultimately in the church. And so we are seeking God and we are seeking to dwell in his house. We're concerned about his house and the church. and that is what we are after. That is what we are longing for. Look as well in Psalm 14. Psalm 14 and verse 2. Psalm 14 and verse 2, the Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. God wants to know, are there any out there that are seeking me? Notice as well, Psalm 53 and verse 2. God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. Folks, God is never going to overpower our will. He's never going to come in, reach within our brains and direct us like robots so that we can do His will, so that we can seek Him and seek spiritual greatness. It is on us. It is our decision. It is our choice to seek after God. So God, as this two sets of Psalms describe for us, is looking down from heaven upon the earth and inquiring, wondering whether or not anyone is seeking after Him. We are required to seek after God. Let's look at a few other passages. Notice in Psalm 34. Psalm 34 and verse 14. Psalm 34 and verse 14. Here we read, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. Seek peace and pursue it. Peace is not something that's just going to fall upon our lap. It's not something that we're going to come across accidentally. We all know this and understand this given our daily lives. But is instead something that we have to seek out and that we have to pursue. Notice Psalm 63. Psalm 63 and verse 1. Psalm 63 and verse 1. O God, you are my God. I think we sing a song along these lines. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. God, spiritually speaking, it's a drought. Spiritually speaking, there seems to be no one who's interested in doing your will, doing your commandments and abiding in your way. It is dry. It is a thirsty land. My flesh longs for you. My soul thirsts for you. I'm going to seek you early. You are my God. Notice Psalm 69. Psalm 69. And notice here beginning in verse 23. Psalm 69, verse 29. Psalm 69, Psalm 63 and verse 1. And then we're going to go back to Psalm 69 in just a second. Psalm 63 in verse 1. We just read that. Psalm 69. I'm sorry, all over the place. Just making sure y'all are awake. Psalm 69 and verse 29. There we go. Psalm 69 verse 29. But I am poor and sorrowful. Let your salvation, O God, set me up on high. I will praise the name of God with a song and will magnify Him with thanksgiving. This also shall please the Lord better than an ox or bull which has horns and hooves. The humble shall see this and be glad. And you who seek God, your hearts shall live. For the Lord hears the poor and does not despise His prisoners. It's interesting here in this psalm, given the context of the sacrifice here being called out. The Lord desiring here something other than just simply sacrifice. It's not that He doesn't desire sacrifice. He does. He commands sacrifice. He did in the Old Testament. He does likewise from us today in the New Testament. But He desires more than just simply sacrifice. He desires our hearts as well to be right. That we are actually longing and desiring to be with Him. That we are actually seeking after Him. And there's a huge difference between just going through the motions and just, quote, sacrificing the Lord, putting a check in the box, and our hearts actually being invested into the practice of worshiping Him, serving Him, and looking and longing after Him. Notice what Micah writes in Micah chapter 6. Micah chapter 6, beginning here in verse 7. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for the transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? We've studied this before. Micah is essentially anticipating the questions of God's people. Hey God, we just can't seem to please you. If we gave you all the sacrifices that we possibly could, you still wouldn't be happy. Well, the conclusion is provided for us there in verse 8. He has showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Notice as well, 1 Samuel chapter 15, 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 22, Samuel's response here to Saul, King Saul. in his explanation as to why it was that he was disobeying God. Hey, I just want to sacrifice to the Lord thy God in Gilgal. Verse 21, Samuel responds, verse 22, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Folks, just going through the motions, just sacrificing to God and putting a check in the box isn't going to cut it. And that's a very difficult thing for those of us who have been Christians for any amount of time. Especially those of us who have been raised in the Lord's church, been brought up, sitting in the pews our entire life. Been trained as to what it is that God expects of us. In many ways, we've never had to seek at all, those of us who are in that category. I wasn't. But I know of those who were. Never had to seek God at all. It was constantly just provided. So not really knowing what it's like to be hungry, not really knowing what it's like to be totally and completely void of any spiritual guidance. And so that's why being reminded that God commands us to seek is good. Because sometimes we can think, well, it's all just being handed to me anyway. I don't really need to study the Bible. I don't really need to memorize God's Word. I don't really need to pray after Him and seek after Him and long to go to heaven and be with Him. It's just being handed to me. It's just falling in my lap. No, seeking. Folks, seeking is commanded. Notice Psalm 70. Psalm 70 here. And verse 4. Let all those who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. And let those who love your salvation say continually, let God be magnified. How are we going to rejoice? How are we going to be glad? How are we going to be able to say God should be magnified? We're seeking after Him. We're seeking after Him. Notice a few verses here in the book of Proverbs. Notice Proverbs chapter 2. Proverbs chapter 2. And notice here beginning in verse 3. Proverbs chapter 2 beginning in verse 3. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding. If you seek her as silver. Her here is personifying wisdom. Notice verse 2. The entire book is on wisdom, but in this context it's specifically dealing with wisdom. If you seek her, who's her? Wisdom. If you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk uprightly. He guards the paths of justice and preserves the way of His saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path. Folks, it has to be sought. It has to be longed for. It has to be desired by the hearer in order for it to be effective in one's life. Notice Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8. Notice here beginning in verse 16. By me, once again, wisdom being personified. Notice verse 12 beginning. By me, princes rule and nobles, all the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. Well, what kind of seeking are we talking about here? Are we talking about just kind of a casual seeking? You know, God commands it. We see that plainly. But is it just, maybe I'm kind of interested? Or is there a diligence that's required? There's a certain amount of effort. There's a certain amount of labor. There's a certain amount of work that we have to actually put forward in order to properly seek the wisdom of God. Notice also Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs chapter 18. Notice here verse 15. The heart of the prudent acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. Notice also Proverbs chapter 28. Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 5. Proverbs 28 and verse 5. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all. And folks, what a blessing that is. We live in a confusing world. We live in a world that is discombobulated and that is disjointed and that has all kinds of narratives and versions of truths that are out there. how are we going to be able to internalize this? How are we going to be able to understand this appropriately? Can we really understand everything? Can we understand all? We may not actually get to the root cause of the understanding, but we can understand it high level enough to be able to put the pieces together in our mind and recognize what it is that's really going on here and why it is that this is happening and how it is that I can find comfort given this situation. God provides that when wisdom is sought, and He provides it. We know that. So seeking, the actual practice of seeking God, it indeed is commanded. But seeking is also comforting. Seeking is also comforting. Notice with me in 1 Chronicles chapter 16. 1 Chronicles chapter 16. God here is going to provide to His Old Testament people some words regarding seeking. In verse 10, we read, "Glory in His holy name. Let the hearts of those rejoice who seek the Lord." Notice also in the second book, chapter 7, 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14. "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." God's people had problems when it came to departing from Him. In many ways, they were just like folks that we mentioned a few minutes ago, raised and brought up, constantly being trained, constantly being programmed in many respects regarding God's law. And this is what God expected His people to do. If you recall, back in Deuteronomy chapter 6, God's people were trained and were taught to do this. Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning there in verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Let me ask you a question. Are the children, literally the children, the young people of Israel, who are being brought up in this environment, do they really know what it means to seek after God? Or was that something that they would have had to have been trained and taught how to do? There's a big difference between someone who is lost, who is without the truth, who's in denominational error, recognizing the fruits of it, just as we understand occurs, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, recognizing that none of this inconsistency makes any sense. It all equals error. Clearly, there's lost status with this people. And so what then is the truth? Then there is a yearning, there's a burning, there's a longing to understand it. But for those who've just been raised and brought up in it, who have had it handed in their lap, who have been trained just as God had commanded His people in the Old Testament to train their young people, that certainly would have been a difficult thing to understand and contemplate what it means to seek. And so you see then God giving scriptures and examples throughout the Bible, as we read several of them just a minute ago, comparing it to what it means to seek after silver. Hey, just as you seek after silver, seek after wisdom. Just as you understand what it means to long for something physical, given the state that you're in, you should long for spiritual righteousness and understanding. Folks, in many respects, these are the kind of comparisons that we can make to those who are being brought up in the church. Hey, you know what it means to seek after X, Y, and Z. Because I've seen your behavior. I've seen the way that you act. I know that you get the idea of seeking something. Now you need to pivot and apply that to spirituality. Yes, you've been handed it. Yes, it's right there in black and white. But you still have to seek after it. Well, the Old Testament people of God, again, they failed to get this message in many respects. And so the book of Chronicles, we then see God commanding them to seek after Him, commanding them to long for His face, to diligently pursue Him. And unfortunately, they wouldn't abide in these commands, and Jeremiah chapter 6 then tells us in verse 16, "Thus saith the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls." But they said, "We will not walk in it." And we've studied this passage several times together also. You see here the rebellion of God's people, but you also see what it is that God expects them to do. He expects them to look after these old paths. Why the old paths? Why is it that those should be sought? Well, I know that young people usually don't get this, but it brings comfort. It brings comfort. Seeking is comforting. What we know, what we understand, what is absolutely true, although maybe we've heard it 1,000 times, although maybe we've heard hundreds of sermons on it, read it in our Bible multiple times throughout our childhood, multiple times throughout our adulthood, that oldness actually yields a comfort, a tried and true bliss. That swaying away and going a different path will not ever, ever bring. That which is new is only new for a short period of time, and then it gets old real, real quick. And it gets boring real, real fast. And the fruit of all that which has been sown, that has not been according to the will of God, begins to be experienced, begins to be realized, and all of a sudden you're far, far, far off the course, farther than you would have ever imagined yourself having been. As long as you live to go back and seek those paths once again. Seeking is comforting. It is comforting. The Old Testament people, these rulers in the New Testament, would have a very similar mindset to those that we just described. And in John chapter 5, Jesus here is trying to get through to them. John chapter 5 and in verse 39, Jesus here explains what they should be seeking after, what it was that they were looking for. He says, "You search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and these are they which testify of me." Yes, you can find the comfort if you're willing to give up your own idea, your own framework as to how things should work. You're going to find me in those Scriptures if you would just seek after them correctly and search them as you ought to be. Seeking is comforting. Those who do not seek the will of God, do not seek the righteousness of God, instead seek something contrary, are instead going to find themselves empty. Psalm chapter 10 and verse 4, we read, "The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts." The wicked have a void. They have an absence when it comes to what it is that they are finding, because they're not seeking after righteousness. They're trying to find some level of comfort elsewhere, and so therefore have no peace in their thoughts. Notice also Proverbs chapter 23. What else might be sought instead of the righteousness of God? Well, we can pursue understanding. We can pursue a level of comfort through other means, but that's not going to yield peace. That's not going to yield the comfort that we desire. Instead, it's going to bring about more sorrow. Again, God is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. Well, what if we sow alcoholism? What if we sow some level of temporary false bliss, and by doing so, we get the fruit of that type of work. Notice here Proverbs chapter 23, beginning there in verse 29. "Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine." So they're pursuing something, they're seeking something, they're trying to find comfort, but they're not looking in the law of God. They're looking in the bottle. Verse 31, "Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, cup moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder." It poisons you. That's what alcohol does. It poisons your mind. Verse 33, thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mast. Confused. Verse 35, they have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. In other words, I was numb because of the alcohol. And folks, that's a lot of times, that's the reason why people pursue it. That's why they seek it. Because they think the outcome, the fruit of it, is going to be comfort, is going to be relief, is going to be some kind of pacification for the difficulties that they are enduring. But in actuality, it just brings it even more. And so it ends then, when shall I wake? I will seek it yet again. I've seen the outcome of it. I've seen what it's brought me in my life. And although it's brought me exactly the opposite of what it was I was looking for, because I'm in a confused state, yes, that's what I'm going to pursue even more so, once again. And so seeking is commanded, seeking is comforting. But think about this also. Seeking is commissioned. Seeking is commissioned. Jesus commands us to go into all the world and to preach the gospel to every creature, to teach all nations. And in doing so, Ron led a song just a few minutes ago regarding the seeking that we should employ when it comes to evangelism. How really can we understand that? Look with me in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, we have Soul Seeking Saturday coming up in just a few days. We have a gospel meeting that's going to follow. We have a lunch that very day that's going to follow our soul seeking in the morning. What a blessed opportunity to go out and find souls who need the gospel. Well, should I partake in that? Should that be something I bring my family to engage in? Should that be something that I should be involved in? Well, notice here, Luke chapter 15, beginning in verse 4, what man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. Notice as well, verse 8, or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the piece which I lost. Folks, these people are seeking, they're searching for that which is lost. Now, oftentimes we will correlate this chapter with those who are children of God who then go astray, especially if you consider the parable of the prodigal son, verses 11 through the end of the chapter. But folks, we don't realize how many people out there may actually be brethren. Hannah and I have come across a few people recently that either were brethren and lost, or were aware, had some kind of exposure to the church. Now, you wouldn't have thought that immediately. Of course, we go out here into the community and we probably get certain ideas in our mind as to how these folks are and how they might be receptive or not receptive to our efforts to win them to the gospel. But we really have no clue where they're coming from. We really have no idea as to what they understand concerning the church and where they are in their life regarding their spirituality and their willingness to search and seek out God. And although we live in a country where people at any point in time can find the truth just by Google searching it, we still have a responsibility to carry out the Great Commission. Seeking is commissioned. We are charged to go out and seek lost souls. So maybe you're here tonight and maybe you're in a situation, brother or sister, where you have stopped seeking. You didn't recognize it was commanded. You are finding comfort by some other means, or maybe you've just given up on the commission and trying to seek out lost souls yourself. If that's the case, if you need to repent or be restored, we're here for you. We want to assist you in any way that we can. If you're here tonight, maybe you're in that situation, not yet a child of God, what won't you do as Hank prayed just a few minutes ago and be baptized before you leave this building and depart from us, and that you can be right with God, having the hope of everlasting life when you leave this earth. If you have any spiritual need this evening, if you need to be baptized into Christ, if you need to be restored to the church, we hope that you come forward as all